Hi everyone, it's Paranoid and welcome back to another reading of If Only They Could Talk by James Herriot. Chapter 7. I huddled deeper in the blankets as the strident bidding, 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 bidding of the telephone echoed through the old house. It was 3 weeks since Tristan's arrival, and life at Scaledale House had settled into a fairly regular pattern. Every day began much the same, with the phone ringing between 7 and 8 o'clock, after the farmers had had the first look at their stock. There was only one phone in the house. It rested on a ledge in the tiled passage downstairs. Siegfried had impressed on me that I shouldn't get out of bed for these early calls. He had delegated the job to Tristan. The responsibility would be good for him. Siegfried had been emphatic about it. I listened to the ringing. It went on and on. It seemed to get louder and louder. There was neither sound nor movement from Tristan's room, and I waited for the next move in the daily drama. It came, as always, with a door crashing back on its hinges. Then Siegfried rushed out onto the landing and bounded down the stairs 3 at a time. A long silence followed, and I could picture him shivering in the draughty passage, his bare feet freezing on the tiles as he listened to the farmer's leisurely account of the animal's symptoms. Then the ting of the phone in its rest, and the mad pounding of feet on the stairs as Siegfried made a dash for his brother's room. Next, a wrenching sound as the door was flung open, then a yell of rage. I detected a note of triumph. It meant Tristan had been caught in bed. A definite victory for Siegfried, and he didn't have many victories. Usually, Tristan exploited his quick dressing technique and confronted his brother fully dressed. It gave him a psychological advantage to be knotting his tie when Siegfried was still in pajamas. But this morning, Tristan had overplayed his hand, trying to snatch a few seconds. He was caught between the sheets. I listened to the shouts. "Why didn't you answer the bloody phone like I told you? Don't tell me you're deaf as well as idle. Come on, out of it, out, out." But I knew Tristan would make a quick comeback. When he was caught in bed, he usually scored a few points by being halfway through his breakfast before his brother came in. Later, I watched Siegfried's face as he entered the dining room and saw Tristan munching his toast happily, his daily mirror balanced against the coffee pot. It was as if he had felt a sudden twinge of toothache. It all made for a strained atmosphere, and I was relieved when I was able to escape to collect my things for the morning round. Down the narrow passage, with its familiar, exciting smell of ether and carbolic, and out into the high-walled garden which led to the yard where the cars were kept. It was the same every morning, but to me there was always the feeling of surprise. When I stepped out into the sunshine and the scent of flowers, it was as though I was doing it for the first time. The air held a breath of the nearby moorland. After being buried in a city for 5 years, it was difficult to take it all in. I never hurried over this part. There could be an urgent case waiting, but I still took my time. Along the narrow part between the ivy-covered wall and the long offshoot of the house where the wisteria climbed, pushing its tendrils and its withered blooms into the very rooms. Then past the rockery where the garden widened to the lawn, unkempt and lost looking, but lending coolness and softness to the weathered brick. Around its borders, flowers blazed in untidy profusion, battling with a jungle of weeds. And so to the rose garden, then an asparagus bed whose fleshy fingers had grown into tall fronds. Further on were strawberries and raspberries. Fruit trees were everywhere, their branches dangling low over the path. Peaches, pears, cherries, and plums were trained against the south wall, where they fought for a place with the wild growing rambler roses. Bees were at work among the flowers, and the song of blackbirds and thrushes competed with the cawing of the rooks high up in the elms. Life was full for me. There were so many things to find out and a lot I had to prove to myself. The days were quick and challenging, and they pressed on me their very newness, but it all stopped here in the garden. Everything seemed to have stopped here a long time ago. I looked back before going through the door into the yard, and it was like suddenly coming across a picture in an old book. The empty wild garden and the tall silent house beyond. I could never quite believe it was there, and that I was a part of it. And the feeling was heightened when I went into the yard. It was square and cobbled, and the grass grew in thick tufts between the stones. Buildings took up two sides, the two garages, once coach houses, a stable and saddle room, a loose box, and a pigsty. Against the free wall, a rusty iron pump hung over a stone water trough. Above the stable was a hayloft, and over one of the garages, a dovecot. And there was old Boardman. He too seemed to have been left behind from grander days, hobbling round on his lame leg, doing nothing in particular. He grunted good morning from his cubbyhole where he kept a few tools and garden implements. Above his head, his reminders of the war looked down, a row of coloured prints of Bruce Bairnsfather cartoons. He had stuck them up when he came home in 1918, and there they were still, dusty and curled at the edges, but still speaking to him of Kaiser Bill and the shell holes and muddy trenches. Boardman washed a car sometimes, or did a little work in the garden, but he was content to earn a pound or two and get back to his yard. He spent a lot of time in the saddle room, just sitting. Sometimes he looked round the empty hooks where the harness used to hang, and then he would make a rubbing movement with his fist against his palm. He often talked to me of the great days. I can see Towed Doctor now, standing on top step, waiting for his carriage to come round. Big, smart-looking feller he was. Allus wore a top hat and a frock coat. And I can remember him when I was a lad, standing there, pulling on his gloves and giving his hat a tilt while he waited. Boardman's features seemed to soften, and a light came into his eyes, as though he were talking more to himself than to me. The old house was different then. A housekeeper and 6 servants there were, and everything just so. And a full-time gardener. There weren't a blade of grass out of place in them days, and the flowers all in rows, and the trees pruned tidy-like. And this yard, it were Towed Doctor's favourite spot. He'd come and look over t' door at me sitting here polishing the harness, and pass time o' day, quiet-like. He were a real gentleman, but you couldn't cross him. A few specks o' dust anywhere down here, and he'd go nearly mad. But the war finished it all. Everybody's rushing about now. They don't care about them things now. They've no time at all. He He would look round in disbelief at the overgrown cobbles, the peeling garage doors hanging crazily on their hinges, at the empty stable and the pump from which no water flowed. He was always friendly with me in an absent way, but with Siegfried he seemed to step back into his former character, holding himself up smartly and saying, "Very good, sir," and saluting repeatedly with one finger. It was as though he recognized something there, something of the strength and authority of Taut Doctor, and he reached out eagerly towards the lost days. "Morning, Boardman," I said, as I opened the garage door. "How are you today?" "Oh, middlin', lad, just middlin'." He limped across and watched me get the starting handle and begin the next part of the daily routine. The car allotted to me was a tiny Austin of an almost forgotten vintage, and one of Boardman's voluntary duties was towing it off when it wouldn't start. But this morning, surprisingly, the engine coughed into life after 6 turns. As I drove round the corner of the black lane, I had the feeling, as I did every morning, that this was where things really got started. The problems and pressures of my job were waiting for me out there, and at the moment I seemed to have plenty. I had arrived in the Dales, I felt, at a bad time. The farmers, after a generation of neglect, had seen the coming of a prophet, the wonderful new vet, Mr. Farnan. He appeared like a comet, trailing his new ideas in his wake. He was able, energetic, and charming, and they received him as a maiden would a lover. And now, at the height of the honeymoon, I had to push my way into the act, and I just wasn't wanted. I was beginning to get used to the questions. "Where's Mr. Farnan? Is he ill or something? I expected Mr. Farnan." It was a bit daunting to watch their faces fall when they saw me walking on to their farms. Usually they looked past me hopefully, and some even went and peered into the car to see if the man they really wanted was hiding in there. And it was uphill work examining an animal when its owner was chafing in the background, wishing with all his heart that I was somebody else. But I had to admit they were fair. I got no effusive welcomes, and when I started to tell them what I thought about the case, they listened with open skepticism. But I found that if I got my jacket off and really worked at the job, they began to thaw a little, and they were hospitable. Even though they were disappointed at having me, they asked me into their homes. "Come in and have a bit of dinner," was a phrase I heard nearly every day. Sometimes I was glad to accept, and I ate some memorable meals with them. Often, too, they would slip a half-dozen eggs or a pound of butter into the car as I was leaving. This hospitality was traditional in the Dales, and I knew they would probably do the same for any visitor. But it showed the core of friendliness which lay under the often unsmiling surface of these people, and it helped. I was beginning to learn about the farmers, and what I found I liked. They had a toughness and a philosophical attitude which was still new to me. Misfortunes which could make the city dweller want to bang his head against a wall were shrugged off with, "Aye, well, these things happen." And it looked like being another hot day, and I wound down the car windows as far as they would go. I was on my way to do a tuberculin test. The national scheme was beginning to make its first impact in the Dales, and the more progressive farmers were asking for survey tests. And this was no ordinary herd. Mr. Copperfield's Galloway cattle were famous in their way. Siegfried had told me about them. The toughest lot in this practice. There's 85 of them, and none has ever been tied up. In fact, they've scarcely been touched by hand. They live out in the fells. They calve and rear their calves outside. It wasn't often anybody goes near them, so they're practically wild animals. What do you do when there's anything wrong with them? I had asked. Well, you have to depend on Frank and George. They're the two Copfield sons. They've been reared with those cattle since they were babies. Started tackling the little calves as soon as they could walk, and worked up to the big ones. They're about as tough as the Galloways. Copfield's place was one of the bleak ones, looking across the sparse pastures to the bald heights with their spreading smudges of heather. It was easy to see why the farmer had chosen a breed hardier than the local shorthorns. But this morning the grim outlines were softened by the sunshine, and there was a desert peace in the endless greens and browns. Frank and George were not as I expected. The durable men who had helped me in my daily jobs tended to be dark and lean with stringy muscles, but the Copfields were golden-haired and smooth-skinned. They were good-looking young men, about my own age, and their massive necks and wide spread of shoulder made their heads look small. Neither of them was tall, but they looked formidable with their shirt sleeves rolled high to reveal wrestler arms and their thick legs encased in cloth gaiters. Both wore clogs. The cattle had been herded into the buildings, and they just about filled all available accommodation. There were about 25 in the long passage down the side of the fold yard. I could see the ragged line of heads above the rails, the steam rising from their bodies. 20 more occupied an old stable, and 2 lots of 20 milled about in large, loose boxes. I looked at the black, untamed animals, and they looked back at me, their reddish eyes glinting through the rough fringe of hair that fell over their faces. They kept up a menacing, bad-tempered swishing with their tails. It wasn't going to be easy to get an intradermal injection into every one of them. I turned to Frank. Can you catch these beggars? I asked. We'll have a bloody good try, he replied calmly. Throwing a halter over his shoulder, he and his brother lit cigarettes before climbing into the passage where the biggest beasts were packed. I followed them and soon found that the tales I had heard about the Galloways hadn't been exaggerated. If I approached them from the front, they came at me with their great hairy heads, and if I went behind them, they kicked me as a matter of course. But the brothers amazed me. One of them would drop a halter on the beast, get his fingers into the nose, and then be carried away as the animal took off like a rocket. They were thrown about like dolls, but they never let go. Their fair heads bobbed about incongruously among the black backs. And the thing that fascinated me was that through all the contortions, the cigarettes dangled undisturbed. The heat increased till it was like an oven in the buildings, and the animals, their bowels highly fluid with their grass diet, ejected greenish brown muck like non-stop geysers. The affair was conducted in the spirit of a game, with encouragement shouted to the man in action. Thou has him, Frank! Sniggle him, George! In moments of stress, the brothers cursed softly and without heat. Get off my bloody foot, thou old beach! They both stopped work and laughed with sincere appreciation when a cow slashed me across the face with her sodden tail. And another little turn, which was well received, was when I was filling my syringe with both arms raised, and a bullock, backing in alarm from the halter, crashed its craggy behind into my midriff. The wind shot out of me in a sharp hiccup. Then the animal decided to turn around in the narrow passage, squashing me like a fly against the railings. I was pop-eyed as it scrambled around. I wondered whether the creaking was coming from my ribs or the wood behind me. I finished up with the smallest calves, and they were just about the most difficult to handle. The shaggy little creatures kicked, bucked, sprang into the air, ran through our legs, and even hurtled straight up the walls. Often the brothers had to throw themselves on top of them and bear them to the ground. Before I could inject them, and when the calves felt the needle, they stuck out their tongues and bawled deafeningly. Outside, the anxious mothers bellowed back in chorus. It was midday when I reeled out of the buildings. I seemed to have been a month in there. In the suffocating heat, the continuous din, the fusillade of muck. Frank and George produced a bucket of water and a scrubbing brush, gave me a rough clean-up before I left. A mile from the farm, I drove off the unfenced road, got out of the car, and dropped down on the cool fell side. Throwing wide my arms, I wriggled my shoulders and my sweat-soaked shirt into the tough grass and let the sweet breeze play over me. With the sun on my face, I looked through half-closed eyes at the hazy blue sky. My ribs ached, and I could feel the bruises of a dozen kicks on my legs. I didn't smell so good either. I closed my eyes and grinned at the ridiculous thought that I had been conducting a diagnostic investigation for tuberculosis back there. A strange way to carry out a scientific procedure. A strange way, in fact, to earn a living. But then I might have been in an office with the windows tight shut against the petrol fumes and the traffic noise, the desk light shining on the columns of figures my bowler hat hanging on the wall. Lazily I opened my eyes again and watched a cloud shadow riding over the face of the green hill across the valley. No, I wasn't complaining. Chapter 8. I hardly noticed the passage of the weeks as I rattled along the moorland roads on my daily rounds, but the district was beginning to take shape, the people to emerge as separate personalities. Most days I had a puncture. The tires were through to the canvas on all wheels. It surprised me that they took me anywhere at all. One of the few refinements on the car was a rusty sunshine roof. It grated dismally when I slid it back, but most of the time I kept it open, and the windows too, and I drove in my shirt sleeves with the delicious air swirling about me. On wet days, it didn't help much to close the roof because the rain dripped through the joints and formed pools on my lap and the passenger seat. I developed great skill in zigzagging around puddles. To drive through was a mistake, as the muddy water fountained up through the gaps in the floorboards. But it was a fine summer, and long days in the open gave me a tan which rivaled the farmer's. Even mending a puncture was no penance on the high, unfenced roads with the wheeling curlews for company, and the wind bringing the scents of flowers and trees up from the valleys. And I could find other excuses to get out and sit on the crisp grass and look out over the airy roof of Yorkshire. It was like taking time out of life, time to get things into perspective and assess my progress. Everything was so different that it confused me. This countryside, after years of city streets, the sense of release from exams and study, the job with its daily challenge, And then there was my boss. Siegfried Farnan charged round the practice with fierce energy from dawn till dark, and I often wondered what drove him on. It wasn't money, because he treated it with scant respect. When the bills were paid, the cash went into the pint pot on the mantelpiece, and he grabbed handfuls when he wanted it. I never saw him take out a wallet, but his pockets bulged with loose silver and balled up notes. When he pulled out a thermometer, they flew around him in a cloud. After a week or two of headlong rush, he would disappear, maybe for the evening, maybe overnight, and often without saying where he was going. Mrs. Hall would serve a meal for two, and when she saw I was eating alone, she would remove the food without comment. He dashed off the list of calls each morning with such speed that I was quite often sent hurrying off in the wrong to the wrong farm or to do the wrong thing. When I told him later of my embarrassment, he would laugh heartily. There was one time when he got involved himself. I had just taken a call from Mr. Heaton of Bronset about doing a PM on a sheep. "I'd like you to come with me, James," Siegfried said. "Things are quiet this morning, and I believe they teach you blokes a pretty hot post-mortem procedure. I want to see you in action." We drove through into the village of Bronset, and Siegfried swung the car into a gated lane. "Where are you going?" I said. "Heaton's is at the other end of the village." "But you said Seaton's." "No, I assure you. Look, James, I was right by you when you were talking to the man. I distinctly heard you say the name." I opened my mouth to argue further, but the car was hurtling down the lane and Siegfried's jaw was jutting. I decided to let him find out for himself. We arrived outside the farmhouse with a screaming of brakes. Siegfried had left his seat and was rummaging in the boot before the car had stopped shuddering. "Hell!" he shouted. "No poor post-mortem knife. Never mind. I'll borrow something from the house." He slammed down the lid and bustled over to the door. The farmer's wife answered, and Siegfried beamed on her. "Good morning to you, Mrs. Seaton. Have you a carving knife?" The good lady raised her eyebrows. "What was that you said?" "A carving knife, Mrs. Seaton. A carving knife, and a good sharp one, please." "You want a carving knife?" "Yes, that's right, a carving knife," Siegfried cried, his scanty store of patience beginning to run out. "And I wonder if you would mind hurrying. I hadn't much time." The bewildered woman withdrew to the kitchen, and I could hear whispering and muttering. Children's heads peeped out at intervals to get a quick look at Siegfried, stamping irritably on the step. After some delay, one of the daughters advanced timidly, holding out a long, dangerous-looking knife. Siegfried snatched it from her hand and ran his thumb up and down the edge. "This is no damn good," he shouted in exasperation. "Don't you understand? I want something really sharp. Fetch me a steel." The girl fled back into the kitchen, and there was a low rumble of voices. It was some minutes before another young girl was pushed round the door. She inched her way back up to Siegfried, gave him the steel at arm's length, and dashed back to safety. Siegfried prided himself on his skill at sharpening a knife. It was something he enjoyed doing. As he stropped the knife on the steel, he warmed to his work, and finally burst into song. There was no sound from the kitchen, only the ring of steel on steel, backed by the tuneless singing. There were silent intervals when he carefully tested the edge. Then the noise would start again. When he had completed the job to his satisfaction, he peered inside the door. "Where's your husband?" he called. There was no reply, so he strode into the kitchen, waving the gleaming blade in front of him. I followed him and saw Mrs. Seaton and her daughters cowering, cowering in the far corner, staring at Siegfried with large, frightened eyes. He made a sweeping gesture at them with the knife. Well, come on. I can get started now. Started what? The mother whispered, holding her family close to her. I want to PM this sheep. You have a dead sheep, haven't you? Explanations and apologies followed. Later, Siegfried remonstrated gravely with me for sending him to the wrong farm. You'll have to be a bit more careful in future, James, he said seriously. Creates a very bad impression, that sort of thing. Another thing about my new life, which interested me, was the regular traffic of women through Scaledale House. They were all upper class, mostly beautiful, and had one thing in common: eagerness. They came for drinks, for tea, to dinner, but the real reason was to gaze at Siegfried like parched travelers in the desert sighting an oasis. I found it damaging to my own ego when their eyes passed over me without recognition or interest and fastened themselves hungrily on my colleague. I wasn't envious, but I was puzzled. I used to study him furtively, trying to fathom the secret of his appeal, looking at his worn jacket hanging from the thin shoulders, the frayed shirt collar, and anonymous tie. I had to conclude that clothes had nothing to do with it. There was something attractive in the long, bony face and humorous blue eyes, but a lot of the time he was so haggard and sunken-cheeked that I wondered if he was ill. I often spotted Diana Brompton in the queue, and at these times I had to fight down an impulse to dive under the sofa. She was difficult to recognize as the brassy beauty of that afternoon as she looked up meltingly at Siegfried, hanging on his words, giggling like a schoolgirl. I used to grow cold at the thought that Siegfried might pick her out of the mob and marry her. It worried me a lot because I knew I would have to leave just when I was beginning to enjoy everything about Derby. But Siegfried showed no signs of marrying any of them, and the procession continued hopefully. I finally got used to it and stopped worrying. I got used to my employer's violent changes of front. There was one morning when Siegfried came down to breakfast, rubbing a hand wearily over red-rimmed eyes. Out at 4 a.m., he groaned, buttering his toast listlessly. And I don't like to have to say this, James, but it's all your fault. My fault, I said, startled. Yes, lad, your fault. This was a cow with a mild impaction of the rumen. The farmer had been mucking about with it himself for days. A pint of linseed oil one day, a bit of bicarb and ginger the next, and at 4 o'clock in the morning he decides it's time to call the vet. When I pointed out it could have waited a few more hours, he said Mr. Harriot told him never to hesitate to ring. He'd come out at any hour of the day or night. He tapped the top of his egg as though the effort was almost too much for him. Well, it's all very well being conscientious and all that, but if a thing has waited several days, it can wait till morning. You're spoiling these chaps, James, and I'm getting the backwash of it. I'm sick and tired of being dragged out of my bed for trifles. I'm truly sorry, Siegfried. I honestly had no wish to do that to you. Maybe it's just my inexperience. If I didn't go out, I'd be worried the animal might die. If I left it till morning and it died, how would I feel? That's all right, snapped Siegfried. There's nothing like a dead animal to bring them to their senses. They'll call us out a bit earlier next time. I absorbed this bit of advice and tried to act on it. A week later, Siegfried said he wanted a word with me. James, I know you won't mind my saying this, but old Sumner was complaining to me today. He says he rang you the other night, and you refused to come out to his cow. He's a good client, you know, and a very nice fellow, and he was quite shirty about it. We don't want to lose a chap like that. But it was a chronic mastitis, I said. A bit of thickening in the milk, that's all. He'd been dousing it himself for nearly a week with some quack remedy. The cow was eating all right, and so I thought it would be quite safe to leave it till the next day. Siegfried put a hand on my shoulder and said an excessively patient look spread over his face. I steeled myself. I didn't mind his impatience. I was used to it and could stand it, but the patience was hard to take. James, he said in a gentle voice, there's one fundamental rule in our job which transcends all others, and I'll tell you what it is. You must attend. That is it. It ought to be written on your soul in letters of fire. He raised a portentous forefinger. You must attend. Always remember that, James. It is the basis of everything, no matter what the circumstances, whether it be wet or fine, day or night. If a client calls you out, you must go, and go cheerfully. You say this didn't sound like an urgent case. Well, after all, you have only the owner's description to guide you, and he is not equipped with the knowledge to decide whether it is urgent or not. No, lad, you have to go. Even if they have been treating the animals themselves, it may take a turn for the worse. And don't forget, wagging the finger solemnly, the animal may die. But I thought you said there was nothing like a dead animal to bring them to their senses, I said querulously. What's that? Barked Siegfried, utterly astonished. Never heard such rubbish. Let's have no more of it. Just remember, you must attend. Sometimes he would give me advice on how to live, as when he found me hunched over the phone, which I had just crashed down. I was staring at the wall, swearing softly to myself. Siegfried smiled whimsically. Now what is it, James? I've just had a torrid 10 minutes with Ralston. You remember the outbreak of calf pneumonia? Well, I spent hours with those calves, poured expensive drugs into them. There wasn't a single death, and now he's complaining about his bill. Not a word of thanks. Hell, there's no justice. Siegfried walked over and put his arm around my shoulders. He was wearing his patient look again. My dear chap, he cooed, just look at you, red in the face, all tensed up. You mustn't let yourself get upset like this. You must try to relax. Why do you think professional men are cracking up all over the country with coronaries and ulcers? Just because they allow themselves to get all steamed up over piffling little things like you are doing now. Yes, I know these things are annoying, but you've got to take them in your stride. Keep calm, James. It just isn't worth it. I mean, it will all be the same in 100 years. He delivered the sermon with a serene smile, patting my shoulder reassuringly like a psychiatrist soothing a violent patient. I was writing a label on a jar of red blister a few days later when Siegfried catapulted into the room. He must have kicked the door open because it flew back viciously against the rubber stop and rebounded almost into his face. He rushed over to the desk where I was sitting and began to pound on it with the flat of his hand. His eyes glared wildly from a flushed face. "I've just come from that bloody swine Holt," he shouted. "Ned Holt, you mean?" "Yes, that's who I mean, damn him." I was surprised. Mr. Holt was a little man who worked on the roads for the county council. He kept 4 cows as a sideline, and never been known to pay a veterinary bill. But he was a cheerful character, and Siegfried had rendered his unpaid services over the years without objection. "One of your favorites, isn't he?" I said. "Was, by God, was," Siegfried snarled. "I've been treating Muriel for him. You know, the big red cow, second from the far end of his byre. She had recurrent tympany, coming in from the field every night, badly blown. I tried about everything. Nothing did any good. Then it struck me that it might be antisobacilliosis of the reticulum. I shot some sodium iodine into the vein, and when I saw her today, the difference was incredible. She was standing there chewing her cud right as rain. I was just patting myself on the back for a smart piece of diagnosis, and you know what Holt said? He said he knew she'd be better today because last night he gave her half a pound of Epsom salts in a bran mash. That was what had cured her. Siegfried took some empty cartons and bottles from his pockets and hurled them savagely into the waste paper basket. He began to shout again. "Do you know, for the past fortnight I've puzzled and worried and damn nearly dreamt about that cow. Now I've found the cause of the trouble, applied the most modern treatment, and the animal has recovered. And what happens? Does the owner express his thanks for my skill? Does he? Hell, the entire credit goes to the half pound of Epsom salts. What I did was a pure waste of time." He dealt the desk another sickening blow. "But I frightened him, James," he said, eyes staring. "By God, I frightened him. When he made the crack about the salts, I yelled out, 'You bugger!' and made a grab for him. I think I would have strangled him, but he shot into the house and stayed there. I didn't see him again." Siegfried threw himself into a chair and began to churn his hair about. "Epsom salts," he groaned. "Oh God, it makes you despair." I thought of telling him to relax and pointing out that it would all be the same in 100 years. But my employer still had an empty serum bottle dangling from one hand. I discarded the idea. There came the day when Siegfried decided to have my car rebored. It had been using a steady 2 pints of oil a day, and he hadn't thought this excessive. But when it got to half a gallon a day, he felt something ought to be done. What probably decided him was a farmer on market day saying he always knew when the young vet was coming because he could see the cloud of blue smoke miles away. When the tiny Austin came back from the garage, Siegfried fussed around it like an old hen. "Come over here, James," he called. "I want to talk to you." I saw he was looking patient again and braced myself. "James," he said, pacing round the battered vehicle, whisking specks from the paintwork. "You see this car?" I nodded. "Well, it has been rebored, James. Rebored at great expense. And that's what I want to talk to you about. You now have in your possession what amounts to a new car." With an effort, he unfastened the catch, and the bonnet creaked open in a shower of dust and dirt. He pointed down at the engine, black and oily, with unrelated pieces of flex and rubber tubing hanging around it like garlands. "You have a piece of fine mechanism here, and I want you to treat it with respect. I've seen you belting along like a maniac, and it won't do. You've got to nurse this machine for the next 2 or 3 thousand miles. 30 miles an hour is quite fast enough. I think it's a crime the way some people abuse a new engine. They should be locked up. So remember, lad, no flogging, or I'll be down on you." He closed the bonnet with care, gave the cracked windscreen a polish with the cuff of his coat, and left. These strong words made such an impression on me that I crawled around the visits all day almost at walking pace. The same night I was getting ready for bed when Siegfried came in. He had 2 farm lads with him, and they both wore silly grins. A powerful smell of beer filled the room. Siegfried spoke with dignity, slurring his words only slightly. "James, I met these gentlemen in the Black Bull this evening. We've had several excellent games of dominoes, but unfortunately they have missed the last bus. Will you kindly bring the Austin round, and I will run them home?" I drove the car to the front of the house, and the farm lads piled in, one in the front, the other in the back. I looked at Siegfried, lowering himself unsteadily into the driving seat, and I decided to go along. I got into the back. The 2 young men lived in a farm far up on the North Moors, and the 3 miles out of town. We left the main road, and our headlights picked up a strip of track twisting along the dark hillside. Siegfried was in a hurry. He kept his foot on the boards. The note of the engine rose to a tortured scream, and the little car hurtled on into the blackness. Hanging on grimly, I leaned forward so that I could shout into my employer's ear, "Remember, this is the car which has been just rebored," I bellowed above the din. Siegfried looked round with an indulgent smile. Yes, I remember, James. What are you fussing about?" As he spoke, the car shot off the road and bounded over the grass at 60 miles an hour. We all bounced round like corks till he found his way back. Unperturbed, he carried on at the same speed. The silly grins had left the lads' faces, and they sat rigid in their seats. Nobody said anything. The passengers were unloaded at a silent farmhouse, and the return journey began. Since it was downhill all the way, Siegfried found he could go even faster. The car leaped and bumped over the uneven surface with its engine whining. We made several brief but tense visits to the surrounding moors, but we got home. It was a month later that Siegfried had occasion to take his assistant to task once more. "James, my boy," he said sorrowfully, "you're a grand chap, but by God, you're hard on cars. Look at this Austin, newly rebored a short time ago, in tip-top condition, and look at it now, drinking oil. I don't know how you did it in the time. You're a real terror."